everyone. I want to conjure up my South Carolina roots and say, bless your hearts. Y'all have come out in this pouring rain to hear this lecture, and so thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I hope that the lecture really informs and inspires you. I also want to thank Errol and Elaine Davis for the invitation to join you here at Chautauqua as an African American Heritage House lecturer. It is indeed a great honor. I've heard so much about Chautauqua over the years, and this is my first time here, but I promise it will not be my last time. I've had a wonderful experience so far. I also want to thank Drs. Bob Franklin and Helen Gale, who I know also had something to do with me being here, and to thank Olivia Hill for her gracious hospitality as Executive Director of the African American Heritage House. She's truly made me feel at home here. So the title of my talk, Race and the Making of American Religion. In August of 1991, here in the great state of New York, in the borough known as Brooklyn, an extraordinary event occurred that would disrupt and unsettle two communities that had lived at a distant peace for years: the Hasidic Jewish community and the African American community. The deaths of two people, Gavin Cadle and Yankel Rosenbaum, set off what one government report described as, quote, the most widespread racial unrest to occur in New York City in more than 20 years. 3 days of violence between Blacks and Jews. According to anthropologist Henry Goldschmidt, who retells the story in his book, Race and Religion Among the Chosen People of Crown Heights, the disruption occurred after 7-year-old Gavin Cato, a young Black boy with Guyanese roots, was struck and killed by the motorcade of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, or community leader, while playing and riding bikes outside with his little cousin. In response to the incident, a scuffle broke out, and a young Jewish student named Yankel Rosenbaum was stabbed to death. Amongst Black residents of the city, the tensions were understood as a matter of race. For Jewish members of the city, however, the conflict was understood as a matter of religion. The African American community argued that this white community of religious believers held disregard for Black life, as they often stayed to themselves and enjoyed singularly the benefits of their own conclave of businesses and social resources. Furthermore, residents argued that it was evident by the speed at which the motorcade drove through the city streets and the unwillingness of the Jewish ambulance to pick up the dying boy's body and try to save him, it was evident for them that the Hasidic community held disregard, if not complete contempt, for their Black neighbors. The Jewish community, however, argued that the stabbing death of Rosenbaum was because he was Jewish and not because he was white. They argued that the 3 days of conflict that ensued, the fight in the street, was a pogrom, an attack on Jews because they were Jewish. Blacks, however, argued that it was a race riot, a rebellion against white supremacy, based not on the Hasidic community's Jewishness, but upon their whiteness. Which was it, Goldschmidt asked? Was it a pogrom or a race riot? Inherent in this conflict is the debate about race and religion, the intersection of two ideals that have defined and defied the promise of American democracy for centuries. Scholars of religion and anthropologists of race, like myself, have argued that race and religion are inextricably linked. Some suggest, as I do, that these ideas are so thoroughly co-constituted that they are inseparable. The ideas and theologies that shape our religious worlds ultimately shape our racial worldviews and vice versa. In fact, we do not need to go to New York in 1991 to see the history of religion and racial conflict. We can look at our society today and see evidence of this ubiquitous relationship between race and religion. Whether we are pondering the rise of white Christian nationalism, the fallout on college campuses and beyond following the October 7th attacks, or just the prickly way in which immigration is discussed, i.e., quote-unquote, shithole countries, ironically full of Christians. Yet, if we simply consider the very founding of the United States, it is easy to argue that the history of race in this country is in fact a history of religious conflict, a battle over the interpretation of Scripture for Christians, and a struggle amongst other religious groups to either fit into or disrupt the social hierarchy established by American Christianity. In our time together, I want to talk through the ways in which race and religion have been co-constituted in American religious history, whether we are talking about Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, or Judaism. For nearly 2 decades, I've taught a course entitled Race, Class, and the Making of American Religion to college students at Harvard and at Emory. And today I'm going to try and squeeze that 14-week course into a 40-minute lecture, and then ask what this history means to us today. How should it help us shape our understanding of religious and racial difference? And ultimately, given these histories, what are the possibilities for living out a truly multiracial and multi-religious American democracy? A Christian history. European Christian pioneers and settlers with the ideology of manifest destiny envisioned America as a beacon on a hill, a promised land, if you will, for settlers. In the earliest writings of some ministers, one could see the ideals presented of America. John Winthrop, leader of the Puritan expedition at Mass Bay Colony, petitioned his followers that they might obey God so that, quote, the Lord our God may bless us in the land whither we go to possess it. Ezra Stiles declared in 1783 that the U.S. was God's American Israel, that it should be made, quote, high above all nations, which he hath made in praise and in name and in honor, end quote, praying for the prosperity and splendor of the United States. And yet, in the building of this new land, they relied on the labor of enslaved peoples from Africa, justifying such an arrangement through the biblical scriptures. Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister and author of The Negro Christianized, argued, quote, that Christian slaves would know that it is God who has caused them to be servants, and that they served Jesus Christ while they were at work for their masters, end quote. For these early leaders, America was a promised land, promised by the Christian God, and the enslavement of Africans a part of God's plan. In establishing the country, they established it with a keen sense of racial hierarchy built upon religious conviction. In their research on American religious history, contemporary historians like Anthea Butler, Catherine Garber, Elizabeth Jemison, Terence Keel, Catherine Jen Lum, have built upon previous historical research to point out the ways in which Christian scriptures and ideals were used to create a rigid racial caste system in America, defined by notions of whites as superior and chosen and elect, and blacks as cursed and given to subservience and being outcasts. As Gerbner argues, quote, in the antebellum United States, Protestantism was a core feature of pro-slavery ideology, and Southern planters claimed that their plantations were modeled on the slave-holding households of the Old Testament. Drilling down on this idea, Catherine Jen Lum articulates how the very notion of the heathen represents an older binary form of religious difference that was eventually replaced by newer racial hierarchies. In other words, the racial hierarchies, she argues, that we have come to know emerge from notions of religious hierarchies between the saved and the damned, the redeemed and the fallen, the righteous and the heathen. And yet this slave-holding version of Christianity was not the only version of Christianity available. Those engaged in the abolitionist movement deployed a version of Christianity that articulated the freedom of men, even if not their full equality. Progressive Christians argued forcefully against the enslavement of Africans and the extermination of Native Americans. The architects of this competing vision of America, thus established in the earliest years of the nation dueling interpretations of the Christian ideal. Frederick Douglass, embodying the boldest vision of America and the sharpest criticism of American Christendom, famously critiqued the notion of America as a Christian land, let alone a Christian promised land. In the appendix to his autobiography, he opined, "What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels." Douglass's critique, which continues for several paragraphs, lays out the religious conflict that informed the racial world of the antebellum America. Dueling ideals of Christianity, of its mission and vision, informed not only the social relationships of that society, but also the development of Christianity within the United States. For example, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1816, the first African-American denomination would be founded, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, emerging from the Free African Society with a commitment to what some historians have called the 3 E's: evangelism, education, and emancipation. Strikingly different, large white denominations split over the insistence of Southern members upon the maintenance of slavery. In 1844, Methodists split over the issue of slavery into the Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South. In 1845, the Baptists split over the issue of slavery, forming the Southern Baptist Convention, which is today the largest denomination in the United States. In 1857, Presbyterians split over the issue of slavery. The question for the Methodists was, could a bishop serve as a bishop and own slaves? And from this space of discontent, Black Americans built their own churches and denominations and schools largely after emancipation, with an emphasis on the liberating power of the gospel. Central to the founding of large Black denominations like the National Baptist Convention, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the Church of God in Christ, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, was not only a call for personal salvation, but also a call for racial justice and an unyielding pursuit of education. In many ways, this dynamic situates the whole of American Christianity. The debate over slavery is a precursor to the debates that would occur later over the issue of civil rights and women's rights. While some have worked to disrupt the hierarchies established by early American Christianity, others have worked to live within them and force them to conserve, if you will, conserve them over time. Christian debates, however, are not the only ones that animate America's racial history. The stories of Mormons and Muslims and Jews demonstrate how religious traditions on the shores of the Americas adopt or disrupt the very racial hierarchies established by American Christianity. Founded in the 1820s by Prophet Joseph Smith, the Mormon Church emerged in the throes of a developing country. Prophet Smith is said to have experienced divine revelations that he wrote down as a book of guidance and revelation for his followers, called the Book of Mormon. Standing outside of mainline Christian teachings, American religious leaders labeled Smith a charlatan, and the community that he developed in New York had to flee to Missouri and then to Illinois before Smith was killed in 1844 by an angry mob. In order to escape religious persecution, Brigham Young, their new leader, led the community of Mormon pioneers to Utah to establish their community. At the time of Smith's death in 1844, America was in the midst of heated debates about slavery and on the verge of war. Protestant churches were splitting over the issue of slavery, and the Mormon community was, according to some scholars, looking for greater acceptance into the American mainstream. Interestingly, their interpretations of the Book of Mormon led them to assume some of the same racial biases and hierarchies adopted by American slaveholding Christianity. The difference, however, between Mormons' interpretations of race and American Christian interpretations of race was that for Mormons, race was not immutable. It could be changed. Whereas Christian slaveholding theology had determined that blacks were biologically inferior, cursed by God through the curse of Ham, and thus destined to live in perpetual bondage, early Mormonism offered the possibility of change. One could essentially, quote unquote, become white, as religious historian Max Mueller argues, by being baptized into the faith. For Mormons, the hierarchy that defined their understandings of race were based upon spiritual failures. The white-skinned Nephites, as their text labeled God's earliest creations, had presumably obeyed God's laws, but the dark-skinned Lamanites were cursed by God with dark skin because of their disobedience. The only way for Lamanites, which included Black people and Native Americans, many imagine, was to convert to Mormonism. But as late as the 19th and early 20th century, leaders like Brigham Young and Joseph F. Smith worked to gain acceptance of Mormonism into the mainstream of American life, and they began to interpret the faith in a way that prevented Blacks from full membership, which prevented them from the priesthood and temple rituals, even with conversion. Only in 1978 did Mormons lift the ban on Blacks' access to the priesthood and temple rituals. The long history of race and Mormonism marks the ways in which American categories of race were adopted by a religious community working to gain acceptance into the American mainstream. Originally viewed as a cult by American evangelicals, Mormons merged their way into the American religious landscape, becoming one of the wealthiest and most regarded traditions within America. In some ways, scholars have argued that this characteristic has made it one of the quote-unquote whitest traditions in the American religious landscape. While Mormons worked to gain acceptance within the American mainstream, other groups rejected and vigorously challenged the American racial landscape. The growth of the Black Muslim community in the early 20th century marked a near complete rejection of American Christianity, and with it, any desire to acquiesce to the standards of whites. In fact, early forms of Black Islam in the United States, embodied most prominently in the Nation of Islam, turned American racial narratives on their head, not only disrupting the hierarchies established by white Christians, but completely overturning them, placing whites at the bottom of human development. Established in the 1930s in Detroit, Michigan by W.D. Fard Muhammad, who turned over leadership of the community to Elisha Muhammad, the Nation of Islam was one of many alternative Black faith communities established in the mid-century America. Although the Muslim community in the United States has been here at least since the first enslaved people arrived from the shores of Africa, several scholars estimate that 10 to 18% of the African enslaved persons brought over were Muslim. They were not able to establish an institutional home until after emancipation, largely through the founding of the Nation of Islam. Established alongside the Nation of Islam were those whom anthropologist Arthur Fawcett labeled the quote-unquote Black gods of the metropolis. These leaders offered not only alternatives to mainline Protestant Christian belief and practice, they often reinterpreted American racial narratives through their newfound religious lens. Leaders like Father Divine and his Peace Mission movement, or Daddy Grace in the United House of Prayer for All People, Prophet F.S. Cherry in the Church of God, or Black Jews, Noble Drew Ali in the Moorish Science Temple, or Marcus Garvey and Elisha Muhammad, they often remade American logics of race. While some of these leaders reinforced American ideals of race, others completely disrupted them. Some, like Father Divine and Daddy Grace, worked in many ways to erase racial categories altogether through new theologies that labeled people, for example, in Father Divine's Peace Mission movement, based upon their personalities rather than their skin colors. The Nation of Islam, however, similar to the Black Hebrew Israelite community, instead of erasing race, turned racial narratives on their head. Instead of seeing whites as superior and chosen, Black Muslims in the nation decried whites as demonic, quote-unquote blonde-haired, blue-eyed devils, originating from a mad scientist named Yaqub in a laboratory. Early manifestations of the nation labeled Christianity, quote-unquote, the white man's religion, insisting that Blacks who participated in Christianity were subjecting themselves to a perpetual state of subservience in the United States. In fact, part of their racial logic required and insisted that followers reject participation in the United States' economic, political, and social systems. They created instead their own quote-unquote nation within a nation, with their own schools, stores, community centers, and even military. Through printed media like the Final Call newspaper and rousing street oratory, Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam challenged everyday Black people to question their allegiance to American Christianity and the promise of the American dream through integration. The iconic rift between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X embodied this dynamic. As James Cone outlines in his exploration of Martin and Malcolm and America, Martin Luther King's dream contrasted sharply with what Malcolm X described as his American nightmare. King said, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. This is our hope." This vision embodied the progressive Christian vision of social integration that galvanized the civil rights movement. It believed in the possibility of white redemption and racial reconciliation. By contrast, Malcolm X, as spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, and before his trip to Mecca, saw instead an American nightmare. "No," he declared in April of 1964, "I am not an American. I am one of the 22 million Black people who are victims of Americanism, one of the victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare." With the departure of Elijah Muhammad and the assassination of Malcolm X came the exodus of many Blacks from the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam. Religion scholar Sherman Jackson suggests that Black Muslims today must look to what he calls the quote-unquote third resurrection and define for themselves what the parameters of that faith expression will be. Will they focus less on American racial dynamics and conflicts and turn their attention more fully to the world community of Muslims and adopt the Middle East as a central point of concern, versus the ways in which they have focused on poor Black communities that they have traditionally worked to revive? Will they adopt the social norms of immigrant Muslims in an effort to be embraced more fully as equal members of the American Ummah? And how will they reconcile the racial logics that define America as they embrace the worldwide community of Muslims? With similar aims of disrupting the American racial and religious status quo, Black Hebrew Israelites in the 1960s, taking cues from Black nationalist movements in part and Marcus Garvey in part, declared that not only is the possibility of Black redemption in America preposterous, but the very idea that Black people believe that they can find redemption in America is further evidence that Blacks are brainwashed, that Blacks do not know their true identity as descendants of Yah. This community of believers, founded by Ben Ami, born Ben Carter, left Chicago in the late 1960s. They picked up, and instead of creating a separate nation within a nation, they left America, resettling eventually in Dimona, Israel, and setting up a self-sustaining community there. Instead of viewing American change over the years as an evolution, a movement towards greater enlightenment, they view America as in sharp decline through a process of devolution. The cause of Black struggle in America for them is because of constant exposure to and adaptation of European values. As vegans who reject American meal standards, along with numerous other social and cultural norms, they say, for example, that they abide by a divine live it because they eat to live, whereas Americans have a diet because we eat to die. In terms of phrase like this, Black Hebrews demonstrate their strong rejection of America and its values given their deleterious effects on African Americans, those they understand as the original Hebrews. They believe in immortality through veganism and exercise. They believe in self-determination by owning their own grocery stores and gas stations. And they believe in divine language, like the diet and the live it, the deadline versus a lifeline, the sea of life versus the Dead Sea. The questions about race and religion animated in the stories of white and Black Christians, Mormons, Hasidic Jews, Muslims, Black Hebrews, are ultimately questions about race, which inherently inform ideas about who belongs and who does not belong in this American experiment. White Christian settlers saw America as a promised land, a beacon on a hill in its founding. Sadly, alongside that vision came a vision fueled by narrow and racist interpretations of Christianity that compelled and sanctioned enslavement for Blacks and forced removal for Native Americans. In the decades of struggle for Black freedom, Black and white progressive Christians articulated a vision of race and belonging that not only critiqued white slave-holding Christianity, but also painted a picture of universal brotherhood and sisterhood that challenged America's racial status quo. Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam, however, so disillusioned with America, refused to advocate for integration and instead argued for the establishment of a separate nation within a nation. Black Hebrews found the country so irredeemable that they defined a new homeland outside of the United States, moving their community to Israel. These are only a few of the stories of what historian Judith Weisenfeld terms America's religio-racial identities. Today's religio-racial constructs and the social strife that attends them are far from new. In fact, I would argue that they are endemic to this American fabric. They are a continuation of battles fought for centuries now over American citizenship and the idea of progress. Today, as we face the rise of what scholars are terming white Christian nationalism, it's important that we understand this broader American history of race and religious struggle as we work to build an America that is truly multi-religious and multiracial. This contemporary moment demands that we understand that the current backlash against voting rights and women's rights is in line with the development of an active and determined white nationalist and white Christian nationalist agenda, one with roots in part in the history of slavery and the rejection of the civil rights movement. To understand this contemporary moment, it is important to understand where this racial religious struggle left off in the 60s. On the heels of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Legal barriers to Black people's full participation in American democracy were, in theory, removed. Following the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Conservative segregationists regrouped in order to continue to maintain social control and fight against the full inclusion of Blacks in American society. As outlined in Carol Anderson's White Rage, white backlash to Black access to the vote was swift. Fierce opponents to Black political progress worked to ensure that Blacks could not effectively redress historical wrongs, and they insisted that since the legal hurdles to full inclusion were removed, that racism no longer stood as a hindrance. If racism existed at all, it only existed as an act of individual malice and not a systemic wrong. Once race was rightly seen as a social construct, not rooted in biology, though certainly real in social outcomes, conservatives began to argue for a quote, unquote, colorblind society. To evade calls for remediation of racial wrongs, conservatives appropriated the message of race as a social construct and argued that we should thus not see race. And to acknowledge race was then equally as racist as early virulent forms of white racism. Hallmarks of the great American society became colorblindness, American individualism, and a belief in strict meritocracy. Any explanation of racial inequality ceased being about innate differences and focused instead on the individual. If race didn't exist, then whether you succeeded or not had nothing to do with race. It had to do with your own hard work or lack thereof and commitment to your own success. And because race did not exist, there was no way to redress historic racial wrongs. For example, the argument over affirmative action became a rallying cry for the right. They argued that the use of race to redress historical wrongs was, in practice, reverse discrimination. To name race became a sign of racism. Racial set-aside programs, minority-majority voting districts, all came under attack in the 80s and the 90s as evidence of a type of reverse racism, and are today, once again, under sharp criticism, given the Supreme Court's decision to overturn affirmative action and state legislatures across the South banning diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Under these logics, to name race is to be racist. So where then do white evangelicals fall in this debate? In the 1960s, white evangelicals in the South, by and large, aligned again with white Southern former segregationists in calling for meritocratic individualism and a colorblind society. And to be fair, a colorblind society became a liberal vision as well. But liberals and the civil rights establishment were not prepared for how this idea would be used against them in the pursuit of justice. Carolyn DuPont, in her book, Mississippi Praying, Southern White Evangelicals and the Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to 1975, offers compelling insight into the mindset of white Southern Baptists and Methodists during and immediately following the Civil Rights Movement. She disrupts the idea that becoming Christian would make people less racist. She writes instead that, quote, white supremacy flourished in part because of evangelical religion's strength and not in spite of it. With this cosmology, white supremacy cultivated its central myth, that Blacks' difficulties arose from their own failings and whites bore neither guilt nor responsibility for them. In other words, there were no systemic problems that needed redress, and white evangelicals' laser-focused attention on personal sin and personal salvation served as the foundation for their social and political outlook, their insistence upon a type of strict individualism. You could see this in Billy Graham's refusal to participate in the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King implored him to do so. Graham instead believed that if he could change individual hearts and minds, the country would change. However, DuPont writes, quote, contrary to evangelicals' assertions, the conversion of every Mississippian in the state would never correct the sufferings caused by an exclusionary political system, a deficient educational system, a discriminatory economic system, and an unfair judicial system. Yet this individualistic notion of social change allowed Mississippians, among other Southern evangelicals, to decry government initiatives as ineffective and unwarranted intrusions. End quote. Government efforts to intervene on matters of social inequality were thus cast in terms of religious values and helped fuel the political organizing and rise of the religious right. On the heels of these debates in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and the growth of American evangelicalism, the questions of race and religion are once again coming center stage. The rise of Christian nationalism is fundamentally not a rise in Christianity per se, but a rise in debates about some of the very hierarchies that early slave-holding Christians enshrined into American law. Religious scholars Andrew Whitehead and Samuel I. Perry, in their book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, argue essentially that Christian nationalism is a battle for power and a maintenance of certain hierarchies. Christian over non-Christian, white over black, male over female, rich over poor, straight over gay. These fundamental hierarchies are at the heart of today's contemporary debates, putting certain people, like blacks and women and gays and immigrants and poor people, back in their place as something of an overt effort to reestablish their vision of a white Christian America. To envision a democratic country, however, that is both multiracial and multi-religious is to envision a world in which difference is not only accepted, but it is celebrated. It is to see God in the glory of God's marvelous and diverse creation and to declare, like God, it is good. Our faith traditions demand much more from us than what we have witnessed in history: battles over race and hierarchy and power and belonging. They demand an emptying out of ourselves, not only for our own good, but for the good of others, in creation of what Dr. King once beautifully and prophetically called the beloved community. Thank you.